What if the greatest threat to humanity wasn't malice or hatred, but something quieter, something far more ordinary, unquestioned, unchallenged, unnoticed? Picture this, not a villain scheming in the shadows, but a room full of people nodding in agreement, repeating what they've been told, never stopping to ask, why? Throughout history, the most devastating decisions were not always driven by evil intent, but by something more insidious, stupidity. Not the cartoonish kind we laugh at, but a dangerous kind, the kind that obeys orders without question, that follows the crowd without thinking, that surrenders its judgment to authority, convenience, or fear. Welcome. Today we'll explore what the German theologian and resistance fighter Dietrich Bonhoeffer called the greatest danger to society: stupidity. Not as a lack of intelligence, but as a moral failure, a surrender of one's capacity to think. We'll look at how this idea reshapes the way we understand history, leadership, and even our daily choices. So, take a breath, let the noise of the world fall away, and join me in a quiet meditation on thought, responsibility, and the terrifying ease with which we give them away. Let's begin. In 1943, while imprisoned by the Nazis for resisting Hitler's regime, theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a short yet haunting reflection, not on cruelty or tyranny, but on stupidity. For Bonhoeffer, stupidity was not merely the absence of intelligence, but something far more dangerous, a moral and social disease. He observed that some of the most destructive people in history weren't driven by hatred or evil intent. They were simply thoughtless, unaware that they had surrendered their ability to reflect, to discern, to resist. Against stupidity, Bonhoeffer wrote, "We are defenseless." And what made it so terrifying, he said, was that it was not an individual weakness, but a collective force that thrives under certain conditions, especially under the influence of power. Bonhoeffer noticed that when people are swept into ideological movements or authoritarian systems, they often stop thinking critically, not because they are incapable, but because they no longer see the need to. They substitute slogans for thought, loyalty for judgment. The stupidity he describes is not foolishness, but obedience disguised as certainty. A soldier following a cruel order, a citizen repeating propaganda, a voter ignoring clear warning signs. All may be intelligent in daily life, but under the shadow of power, they relinquish their conscience. Stupidity, then, is a choice, a retreat from moral responsibility into the comfort of conformity. Bonhoeffer's warning remains disturbingly relevant. In a world filled with information, we often assume ignorance is the enemy, but more dangerous than ignorance is uncritical belief, the kind that wears a confident smile and never asks questions. Like a mirror fogged over by breath, stupidity blurs our perception. We may still look, but we no longer see. And when entire societies stop seeing clearly, history is no longer a lesson, it becomes a cycle. But where does this blindness come from? How does power, be it political, social, or institutional, nurture and spread stupidity like a virus? To answer this, we must step into the corridors of history and examine how intelligence is not only dulled by authority, but reshaped by it. Power, when left unchecked, becomes the sculptor of reality, and it does not always carve truth. Power does not merely corrupt, it distorts. Psychologists have long studied the strange alchemy that occurs when a person gains influence over others. And again, the findings reveal a troubling truth. Power changes how we think. Dr. Keltner, a psychologist at UC Berkeley, found that power reduces empathy and makes people more impulsive. The more authority one holds, the more likely they are to interrupt others, take risks without caution, and overestimate their own wisdom. In a sense, power acts like a fog that descends over the mind. It numbs awareness of others and inflates the self, replacing dialogue with monologue. This helps us understand Bonhoeffer's insight more deeply. Stupidity, in his view, is not an intellectual defect but a failure of judgment, especially under the sway of group loyalty and social conformity. When people are under the influence of power, either as leaders or as followers caught in a powerful system, they begin to think less for themselves. Consider the Chernobyl disaster. The Soviet engineers weren't fools. They were capable, trained professionals. But within a rigid hierarchy that prized obedience over honesty, their doubts were silenced. The warnings were clear, but the pressure to conform was louder. What followed was not simply a technological failure, it was a collapse of thought. In modern psychological terms, this is what we call groupthink, a process where individuals suppress dissent to preserve harmony or hierarchy. Once power enters the room, the conditions are ripe for this contagion. The philosopher Hannah Arendt called it the banality of evil, when otherwise ordinary people cease to think independently and become cogs in a destructive machine. The result is not only evil acts, but a chilling absence of reflection. The more someone feels insulated by authority, the less likely they are to doubt their course, and the more dangerous their certainty becomes. And so, stupidity festers where power goes unquestioned. It multiplies in boardrooms, war rooms, and even online, where influence replaces evidence and confidence replaces inquiry. But what makes this danger so profound is not just that it begins in the mind, it spreads through society, infecting those who never intended to harm. Like a silent contagion, it moves from the powerful to the powerless, until entire communities echo with unexamined beliefs. To understand this epidemic more clearly, we must now turn to the digital age, the new empire of misinformation, where stupidity does not merely endure, but accelerates. In the next insight, we will explore how truth is no longer a shared foundation, but a battlefield, and how the mind, when unguarded, becomes the perfect host for deception. If these ideas have sparked something in you, feel free to pause and share your thoughts in the comments below. This space is for reflection and gentle dialogue. Also consider giving this video a like. Let's continue. Stupidity, Bonhoeffer warned, is not merely an individual flaw, it is a social sickness, an epidemic of unthinking that spreads through communities and institutions like a silent, invisible fire. In his letters from prison, he observed how entire societies could be overtaken by a spirit of docility, where people no longer ask questions, where speech is reduced to slogans, and thought becomes a luxury few dare to afford. It is here that stupidity reveals its most insidious form, not as ignorance, but as the refusal to think in the presence of others. Not because one cannot, but because one will not. This social dynamic was not lost on thinkers like Gustave Le Bon, who wrote about the psychology of crowds. In a crowd, the individual dissolves. Rationality gives way to emotion. Responsibility fades into anonymity. Suddenly, people chant what they do not understand and follow leaders they do not question. The frightening power of stupidity lies in its ability to create a consensus without truth, a shared belief that feels certain, not because it is right, but because it is repeated. Like a contagious idea, it moves not through logic, but through rhythm and volume. The louder it echoes, the more real it seems. We see this in our world today, where algorithms reward outrage, and misinformation travels faster than deliberation. A single falsehood, wrapped in the seductive garb of simplicity, can outrun a dozen truths. On social media, the mind is not only shaped, it is streamlined, narrowed, trained to react rather than reflect. In this digital agora, stupidity is not just tolerated, it is incentivized. The user who shouts, mocks, or blindly reposts becomes more visible than the one who pauses to ask, "Is this true?" And so we find ourselves in a paradox, surrounded by information, yet starved for insight, connected by technology, yet isolated in echo chambers. But the most haunting aspect of this epidemic is its calmness. It does not feel like violence, it feels like safety, the comfort of agreement, the ease of uncritical belonging, the reassurance of being on the right side. These are the tranquilizers of thought. And yet, beneath this still surface, something is breaking. Our ability to confront complexity, to live with doubt, to think for ourselves. How then do we resist this quiet tide? How do we reclaim the courage to think when thinking feels like exile? In the next insight, we turn inward to the individual mind, to the small acts of defiance that begin not with grand gestures, but with a question, a pause, a refusal to repeat what we have not examined. Like a candle lit in a room filled with smoke, the thinking soul becomes its own form of resistance. In a world once guided by the slow unfolding of newspapers, letters, and careful conversation, today we move through a digital torrent, where every moment is flooded by images, headlines, opinions, and half-truths. Social media, once hailed as a tool for connection, has revealed another face, one that accelerates not just communication but confusion. Misinformation thrives in this landscape, not because people are malicious, but because attention has become a currency, and outrage its most profitable form. In such a system, stupidity is not just an accident, it is engineered. Dietrich Bonhoeffer saw long before our time that stupidity is less a lack of intelligence than a state of mind, one that relinquishes responsibility and replaces reflection with reaction. Social media plays directly into this condition. It doesn't ask us to think, it asks us to respond. Algorithms do not favor depth, they favor speed. A carefully reasoned argument is buried beneath a viral meme. Nuance becomes a liability, and the user, bombarded by a stream of dopamine-triggering posts, slowly loses the will, or even the capacity, to question what is being consumed. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, in her work on totalitarianism, warned of the dangers of a society where reality becomes unstable, where facts are no longer shared, and consensus is manipulated. Social media, though decentralized and chaotic, mirrors this danger. It creates many truths, or perhaps none at all. When every opinion is given the same volume and every assertion dressed in certainty, the result is not enlightenment, it is exhaustion. People retreat into mental shortcuts, tribal loyalties and ideologies, not because they are convinced, but because they are overwhelmed. The digital landscape becomes a kind of fog, bright, loud, and blinding. We see the consequences everywhere, in political polarization, in conspiracy theories, in the erosion of public trust. But more quietly, and more dangerously, we see it in the loss of interior life, in the inability to sit with uncertainty, to ask hard questions, to say, "I don't know." The self becomes fragmented across screens, curated for approval, but slowly disconnected from the ground of truth. As philosopher Byung-Chul Han writes, "We are no longer a society of discipline or law, but of performance, of constant display. And in this performance, stupidity is not only unnoticed, it is applauded, rewarded with clicks, likes, and attention." And so, the question returns, how do we live with integrity in a world designed to distract us from thinking? Perhaps the answer lies not in fighting the noise with more noise, but in retreating into a deeper silence. A silence that listens, that waits, that sees through the surface. As we move forward, we explore the quiet defiance of the thinking soul, the last sanctuary against the tide of mindless repetition. Like a lighthouse in a storm, it does not shout, but it remains. It spreads through unthinking repetition. Then resistance begins with the courage to think, not merely to possess information or argue a point, but to reflect, to pause, to wrestle with ambiguity, and to risk the discomfort of challenging what is popular or convenient. Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not call for more educated people, he called for more courageous ones. For him, stupidity was not an intellectual failure, but a moral one, a refusal to engage with reality, to take responsibility for truth. And so, resistance must begin where this refusal ends, in the quiet, often solitary act of saying, "I must see for myself." To think independently is not a solitary act of rebellion, it is a gesture of fidelity to reality. The philosopher Karl Jaspers spoke of existenz, that authentic inner call to become truly oneself in a world that often demands conformity. Intellectual courage, in this sense, is not loud. It does not seek to dominate. It simply refuses to lie, even when silence is easier. We see this in those who ask inconvenient questions, who hold their ground when facts are distorted, who refuse the seduction of collective certainty. These individuals do not speak because they are sure of being right, but because they cannot remain complicit in untruth. In an age shaped by spectacle and consensus, intellectual courage is not glamorous. It may be ignored, mocked, or dismissed. But it is precisely this kind of courage that guards the inner life. Viktor Frankl, writing from the depths of the concentration camps, reminds us that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom. That space is where thinking happens. It is where stupidity is held at bay, not through superiority, but through sincerity. To think is to care. To ask is to believe the world is worth understanding. And perhaps, in that sense, intellectual courage is not just resistance, it is devotion. A devotion to truth, to depth, to reality as it is, not as it is sold. It is the soul's refusal to be mechanized, a quiet, luminous flame in a room filled with shadows. As we turn toward the closing of this reflection, we ask, what becomes of us when we learn to think again? When we reclaim the inner silence that allows wisdom to speak? In the final moments, let us gather the threads and remember, the danger is real, but so is the remedy. Like the first light breaking after a long storm, clarity returns not with noise, but with stillness. So we return to the quiet question that has followed us from the beginning. Is stupidity more dangerous than evil? Through Bonhoeffer's eyes, we've seen that it often is, not because it is louder or stronger, but because it works silently. It blends into the background. It smiles, it repeats, it conforms. Evil may still recognize truth, but stupidity forgets it ever mattered. Together, we've explored how power dulls the edges of thought, how misinformation thrives where reflection is absent, and how social contagion spreads not only opinions, but unexamined assumptions. But we've also seen the antidote, intellectual courage, the strength to pause, to wonder, to not only resist lies, but to search earnestly for what is true, even if it's hard, even if it's lonely. Bonhoeffer's warning was not a condemnation, it was a call, a quiet, firm invitation to each of us to think, to speak, to live with integrity. This isn't about being right, it's about being awake, about refuse drift through a world that rewards those who follow and punishes those who see too clearly. And so, the question becomes personal. Will you be a thinker or a follower? Will you risk awareness in a time that rewards sleep? The world does not need more noise. It needs presence. It needs clarity. It needs those willing to think, not for power, not for pride, but for the dignity of truth itself. Take a breath. Let the silence return. And in that stillness, ask yourself, not what the world wants you to say, but what you, in the deepest part of you, known to be real. That is where resistance begins. That is where thought becomes freedom. Thank you for taking this time to reflect with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Please consider sharing them below. Also, consider joining our growing community by subscribing as we continue this thoughtful journey together.